Dear distinguished guests, I warmly welcome you at the Sir George Radda Memorial Symposium, organized by the board of the Hungarian Corvin Chain and the Hungarian Research Network. A special welcome to Professor Dr. Szilveszter Elvizi, President of the board of the Hungarian Corvin Chain, and Professor Dr. Balázs Gulyás, President of the Hungarian Research Network. I also greet Mr. Mark Radda, son of Sir George Radda, who is with us online. Please note that pictures and video footage of today's event will be recorded and used preliminary for archival purposes. And now I kindly ask Professor Szilveszter Elvizi, our President of the Hungarian Corvin Chain Board, to greet you and deliver his speech.
My dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very difficult moment for me, very moving. This morning, as I was traveling to my office, I was thinking of how to start this afternoon's meeting dedicated to our friend, very best friend, to Sir George Radda. He is a Hungarian-born and Hungarian-British chemist who succeeded to develop something, a machine, nuclear resistance machine, magnetic resonance machine, which is able to save millions and millions of people's lives. A young Hungarian boy left Hungary, crossing the Iron Curtain, and went to England without having a single English word. He spoke fluent French, because that time in Pannonhalma, French was, and in Győr also, one of the most, and in Italian also, an important foreign language. And I think his loss is very devastating for us, for both of us with Balázs, because he was one of our best friends. And I have to mention that he was not only a good friend, but he was who helped Hungarian, young Hungarian, to be educated in England, all over the world, because he was very well known, worldwide known scientist, whose discovery was really very, very important for medical science. Ladies and gentlemen, in my capacity as the president of the board of the Hungarian Corvin Chain, I would like to welcome all of you who have arrived at this very, very special meeting dedicated to George, to our Hungarian colleague, and who was in fact very British, I must admit. That's true. And living in Oxford, in Merton College. Therefore, I am really very much honored to have here you, the Chancellor of the Oxford University, where I used to stay several years. And that time, my supervisor was Sir William Peyton. And South Park Road was my road every day to cross to reach Department of Pharmacology. And I remember the Oxford spirit really made me and made all the Hungarians, Peter Somogyi, for example, or other our young and not very young colleagues, made very well known in science. And I think this is the most important point, to learn from each other. And George and his family coming is really a great honor for me and for us. And in this respect is always, we have to emphasize, we Hungarians, that the knowledge is very important in our career, to learn, to have the best education. And in this respect, I am really honored to have here Father Albin and Father Conrad. And let me greet you very Benedictine way. Salve tibi Domine, laudetur Jesus Christus. That's very typical in Pannonhalma. That was really the school of George. He attended that school and he came from them in 1956. He left Hungary to Austria. And his father was who accompanied him to the Iron Curtain to cross it. 3 siblings left Hungary, and George went to England and became being knighted by the Queen, a young boy from Hungary and knighted by the king. You know, this is really a way of career which is a beautiful example for everybody, because our knowledge is a very talented people anyway, the Hungarians. Don't laugh at me, it's true. We are very proud of having Nobel laureates. Of course, it's not easy to be Nobel laureate from Hungary, in Hungary. And George is a beautiful example, because due to his basic science, started to think. And he was capable of translating the basic science results into practice. And nowadays, Chancellor should help me in this respect. Very important, not only in Oxford or in Cambridge or in California or in Hungary, it's very important everywhere. And I should mention my friend, my very best friend, Balázs, who came home after so many years to be the head of the Hungarian Research Council, Hungarian Research Network, to start a new spirit, a new way of thinking, which is even more important just to learn a technique, the way of thinking. And we Hungarians, in this respect, are rather and very talented. And I have to mention that this symposium, without whom, without Balázs, could not have been organized, because he was who suggested, Lexi, Sylvester, we should organize to pay tribute to Sir George Radda, because he is a beautiful example for other young Hungarians. Just follow him. Basic science, start basic science, and you find something you have to develop. And that was done by George. And in this respect, thank you, George, mentee, because he is a mentee of George, and he's following me in his lecture. And I have to tell you the importance of his discovery. You know, that time, 1974, he published his very first, one of his first findings. And he submitted his paper to Nature. And it was rejected. flatly, we scientists know what it means, flatly rejected, saying the editor, rubbish. Not interesting, the finding. And nowadays, saving the life of hundreds and millions of people. And finally, he fight back. I remember that. He told us the story. He fight back and saying, no, this is important. And finally accepted. 1974. And since then, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the heart clinic because I had some problem with my heart. And I was put into this tube. And I was thinking, George, it's nice to talk to you, but the machine is very noisy. Believe me. Have you ever tried it? No, you are lucky. But anyway, if you will be put into this tube, remember, Sir George Radda, Hungarian-British chemist who deserved the Nobel Prize, he never received it anyway, he reserved it. And he was who discovered that. Let me quote just one sentence from his book, entitled My Life in Science. The complexity of life is a major challenge, and the biology of the whole system must be one of the major targets. And he was absolutely right, because this century, more than ever before, will be changed by science. And biology is the most important. And why? Because they're dealing with human beings. And this is very important, and he suggested several times that the science must be targeted biological problems. Dr. Radda's journey started with just leaving Hungary. After the Russian invasion destroyed the Hungarian Revolution, that's 56. And the whole world was supporting Hungary, the freedom fighters. And let me quote just one sentence from his brother's letter, Shipi's letter. His son is here with us. He wrote, "Our father said, you should go to West to have the feeling of freedom." And he left, and as I already told you, ended up being knighted by the Queen. Ladies and gentlemen, let me show a few pictures of him. Okay. He received the CBE, that is the Command British Empire, in 1919, knighted by the Queen, and also Budapest Semmelweis Award. Professor Tulasa is here, the rector that time, who gave him this award, and Biospectrum and Commander of Cross Order of Merit received from the Hungarian Prime Minister, and in 1918 he became the membership of our Corvin chain. Here are the members. Here is the Speaker of the Parliament, and George, and Foreign Minister, who also a member of our chain. And here are and Eva Martin, the worldwide known opera singer, Metropolitan Opera. He spent several years in Metropolitan Opera all over the world. And just the two new members of our Corvin chain, two years ago, they received the Nobel Prize for physics and biology, physiology and medicine, and they are also our members. And here are George, with our Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, and his wife, Aniko, and myself and two other colleagues. He was nominated and accepted by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He became the member of our academy. I was that time the president of the academy, and I gave him the document that he is the member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He is showing very proudly that he received the Semmelweis Budapest Prize. And also George is here, and the foreign minister, and my wife, and here is two other guys, just to show him that he was very well paid. Now, this appeared, published in the Financial Times in August 1984, and I already told you, I was put into this tube, and very noisy, but plays a very important role in healthcare. It plays a very important role in predicting, firstly, discovering what is the problem inside. Non-invasive method. Your chest or belly is not cut into several pieces without anything. Take a look inside in brain, in the chest, in the body, in living body. That was his discovery. And his first paper he used not human body, he used rat, striated muscle. And just one sentence. With Balázs, we called him using Ann's mobile phone. And he was talking Hungarian, mumbling and slowly. And he said, érdemes élni, worth living. And this is the message you have to take home from him, worth living. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I invite Professor Dr. Balázs Gulyás, as told before, former mentee of Sir George Radda, president of the Hungarian Research Network, to deliver his speech.
Dear friends and dear family members of George, dear Sylvester, members of the Corwin Chain Assembly, and friends of George's. For me, it's very difficult, just like for Sylvester, a very difficult task to say a few words about George at this solemn and august occasion, because George was very important in my life. But before I go into a few stories, I leave the lecturing activity to the others. I give the giving of a beautiful talk to my friends like Irene or Zoltán Molnár, who will give a beautiful lecture later today. I would rather cherry pick a few events in our joint life with George, and would like to focus, like Sylvester did, on the spiritual take-home message of our encounters. In the present assembly here in this room has many common denominators, including, for instance, a common elementary school which I share with Eva, or a common secondary school which I shared with many of you. Tringellazzi, you were also a Benedictine student, Sylvester, and of course the fathers from Pannonhalma, students from Pannonhalma, and name it, name it, name it. And of course, there is another major common denominator, the University of Oxford, which we shared for a number of years, some of you for decades, myself only for one postdoctoral year, Sylvester for a good number of years, and name it, name it, name it. So Oxford is a second major denominator in this room. But the only main prime denominator of us is George, Sir George Radda, Radda George, a friend of ours, a part of our lives. And for me personally, and let me be very personal at this occasion, it's a major and determining person in my scientific career. So I would like to, instead of giving a lecture, just to say a few words about some of the major memories I keep in my mind of George. Because if I would give a full lecture, it would take several hours today. So there are three people in my life, in my scientific life, who had a lasting impact on my life. My first mentor, János Szentágotai, Sidney Brenner, and last but not least, George Radda. I heard of George for the first time when I was a student at Pannonhalma. And let me tell you now something, and please, don't be offended, Irene and dear friends from Oxford. But this school, Pannonhalma, is a few hundred years older than Oxford. We started in 996. And since 996, there has been a continuous presence of teaching at Pannonhalma. Not the secondary school, but its predecessors, the various skolas at Pannonhalma, starting in 996. And when I was just drawing the corridors of the secondary school, because it was a secondary school and a dormitory, so a dorm school as well, I regularly checked the various, we call them tableaus, the different classes who were in the different classes in the different years. And I early on knew practically all the names because I went by, they were in the corridor of these tableaus, and realized that it was George Radda. And it somehow sounded very familiar because we already heard about this and that activities of George's. So I became quite early familiar with the name, but not with the person. I met him for the first time sometime in early 991 when I was a postdoc, and my dear supervisor, Alan Covey, blessed be his memory, told me one day, tomorrow morning you get up early because we have a meeting with one of your compatriots. We have to meet him 7:05 in the morning. Not 7, not 7:15, 7:05, because George was very famous for his notorious obsession of keeping time. And his time slots, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, meant a lot. Because some got 10 minutes, some got only 5 minutes, some got even more time from him. So it was a very unique opportunity, 7:05. So with Alan, we crossed South Park Road and went over from the experimental psychology building to the chemistry building, where I met for the first time in life George. George gave us 10 minutes, and it became a very long discussion, almost until 8, which was extremely long regarding his notorious schedules, and we had a very nice discussion. And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Then, when I was already at the Karolinska and one of the leaders of the world's largest positron emission tomography laboratory, we had 65, 70 collaborators, and I established a few parts of this laboratory, including the preclinical and the high-performance imaging in this building at the Karolinska. He visited me in 2008. He went around the lab, and at the end of this visit, he told me, this country is too small for you. Sweden, 450,000 square kilometers. This country is too small for you. Come to Singapore. Okay, so I visited him in December 2008 for the first time in Singapore. And sooner or later, He helped me because he gave me fantastic advice in all respects. I became one of the founders of Singapore's third medical school, the Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine, where I became professor of translational medicine and head of the neuroscience platform. But before I went to Singapore and stayed there for a good 12 years full time, we had many other meetings, of course, with George. And one of the remarkable meetings was at Semmelweis University. Here is Tivadar, here is George. I'm just next to him. I'm sitting there as a young guy who became, 12 years later, the Semmelweis Prize awardee. So he was before me, and I followed, for some reasons, George in this case also. So I ended up in Singapore, thanks to George, and we met absolutely regularly in Singapore. There were periods when he was staying there full-time, and there were periods when he was already back to Oxford and spent every month a week in Singapore. Unbelievable, every month, traveling from London to Singapore. And every time he arrived, he called me, I am here, come. So every time on a Saturday afternoon, because he arrived always, he used a Friday midnight flight, arrived in Saturday afternoon, I turned up in his apartment at Parhor Villa, and we had a long discussion followed by many other meetings on the week, because we regularly had a number of dinners as well. And at one of these dinners, in Rochester Drive 2, this is the restaurant at Rochester Drive 2, and it was a good 10 years ago, he told me, you know what, it's very nice that you are in Singapore, you are at Karolinska, and you are doing this and that. But at one point of your life, you have to return to Hungary. And you have to lead Hungarian research. Literally, he told me this. It was somewhere in this courtyard, in this restaurant, and he told me, I should have done this also, but now it's you. You have to do that. So I really thank him for this advice, and this is the major reason, or one of the major reasons, I am here at home after 42 years in exile and immigration, thanks to George. But there were so many fantastic meetings with George, and I refer to another restaurant. This is in Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, the Waterfall restaurant, where we had a number of meetings with my other number of meetings every other day with my other major mentor, Sidney Brenner. And at one day, Sidney told me, oh, I hear George is in town. Let's have dinner with George. So we went with George to the Waterhouse restaurant. And who turned up at the table, believe me or not? Jim Watson, Sir James Watson, with his wife. So it was a six-seat table. Sidney was sitting on the left side, I was sitting next to Sidney, and right to me, Carla, Sidney's daughter. In front of Sidney, Jim. In front of me, George, and right of George, or left of George, right to me, was the wife of Jim. And the dinner was unbelievable, great in many respects, not scientifically, but the stories I heard at this dinner. Of course, Jim was telling to Sidney, I think I can prove God exists. Sidney was tapping my arm, good old man. 5 minutes later, Jim told to Sidney, I have to prove God doesn't exist. And it went on like this, and Sidney was just smiling and looking at me. And in the meantime, George was entertaining the two ladies, Sidney's daughter and Jim's wife. And I didn't listen because I listened to Jim and Sidney. But at the end of the dinner, I heard something funny. Jim's wife told, oh, fantastic. I really want to be a student at Pannonhalma. Because, as it turned out later, George explained to the ladies, I am his younger brother. We both were students, which is true, at Pannonhalma. And Pannonhalma is the most fantastic place which you really have to experience, and you have to go there. And it's not enough just to visit Panorama, but you have to be a student. So Jim's wife at the end said, I want to be a student at Panorama. It was something which you can never forget in your life. The other end of the story is that at the end I really had to bring literally in my arms Jim's wife back to the room because she was drinking a bit too much. But that's another story. So after George left Singapore for good, we continued our collaboration. And one of the major interests of George at that time was science policy, research policy. So we prepared a paper, presented at a meeting, well, at that time it was COVID already, a Zoom meeting at the Chinese Academy of Science on a new type of science policy model in the world, opposite to what the majority of the world believed in science policy, founded by Vannevar Bush, the former president of MIT and advisor to President Roosevelt and Truman, the classic division between basic science and applied science. George always lectured me on mission-oriented, society-oriented science, commitment to humanity. And we developed this model, and this was for him a great time when we discussed all these things. We also did some work together, and he told me, never leave me out, I'm really interested in research. So among others, we published this paper some 10 years ago, and, 5 years ago only. It was a monumental paper on nanotherapeutic agents for neurodegenerative diseases, first authored by Dr. Para, my good friend and deputy in Singapore, who was also a student of George's, and who is with us now in spirit because he told me his spirit will be here. So he enjoyed all these activities. His mind never ceased to work on scientific problems, and it was for him a great pleasure. So I visited him several times in Oxford, of course, in his home, in the outskirts of Oxford, and then in Whitney later on, in his retirement home. And we spent several hours together with Sue also, but George was absolutely clean and brilliant in his mind, despite his physical frailty. And for the last time, I visited him just a year ago with a good company. Roland was there also, Zoltán Molnár, and László György, the former state secretary from the government of Hungary. And we had a splendid half a day with George. We had such a fantastic discussion. His mind was crystal clear, sharp as ever. It was a fantastic meeting. Then, of course, I always called him, or he called me, and his last call came on the 13th of August last year. And he told me, my sister has died. And I think that's it. And I told, no, George, no. He said, that's it. And from that moment on, I tried to call him regularly. He never replied. Then Anne called me a week before he passed away and told me, speak to him. And I spoke to him every evening, you remember Anne, once together with Sylvester. And it was extremely moving. And the other thing was very moving, namely that he always talked to me in English for a while. And then at a certain point, he changed. And from that moment on, we only conversed in Hungarian. It was extremely moving, I have to tell you, the human brain. So, of course, I attended the funeral. I will not show pictures of it, but thanks, Irene, for having this unbelievable, noble, and moving event in Merton. So, and the final thing, I asked a good friend of mine to make a bronze medal of George's. And he made this medal, and George tremendously, I would say, appreciated this. He told me, I have so many medals. People made of me pictures, paintings, medals, and so on. But this is the only one which I like. So this is here. Please take a look at it. And more than that, if I may recommend, Lexi, Sylvester, let's make a memorial medal, or let's use this medal as a memorial medal
Very good idea.
by the Corwin Chain Assembly and the Hungarian Research Network, and find a proper procedure to nominate people for this medal and confer the medal upon the right persons in science and research in the future. Let's do so. So I wanted to share with you with these thoughts. Sorry if I have been long and emotional, but as said, George was more for me than just a friend or a mentor. He was a decisive influence upon my career. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these moving words. And now I invite Irene Tracy, former PhD student of Sir George Radda and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford, to continue with her lecture.
Well, good afternoon, dear friends, colleagues, the family members. Lovely to see you again. Members of the Hungarian Research Network, the presidents and the board of the Hungarian Corwin Chain, and it's wonderful to see again the priests and current pupils of that remarkable school, Pannonhalma. Looking forward to my visit there tomorrow. Thank you for including my husband, Miles Allen, who's also a professor at the university, and I, to this very special memorial symposium. And it really is wonderful just to take time out of the day job to just take a moment and reflect back on this extraordinary life of this person who meant so much to us and was so special to all of us. As I mentioned during my eulogy, so many of our careers and life trajectories were made possible because of George and everything about him. And we really count our lucky stars as we say that George was part of our lives and journey, as he obviously was as a family man too. So George was somebody that I knew as an undergraduate. During my fourth year of my undergraduate research degree, we had the opportunity to do a research project. And I was inspired by a lecture that George gave on how we could use, in those days, called nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR, to see biology in the living state. And I was blown away, absolutely captivated. And so I dropped him a note, a handwritten one, because email did not exist, believe it or not, that young man just sitting there at that time. He kindly responded, and that was it. I secured my place to do my project. I enjoyed that research project so much, and I was determined to continue working with him for a research for a doctorate, a PhD, or DPhil as we call it in Oxford. So I've got the spot. I joined his extraordinarily massive research team. That was one of always the remarkable things about George. He had always the biggest research team in Britain, I think. It was a cast of thousands. And like all of those, many of whom are here today, just had the very best of times, and I never look back. Without George's willingness and enthusiastic support to let all of us during those critical years of doing our PhDs pursue our particular areas of interest and passion, I wouldn't have moved from his passion, which was the muscle, to the brain, and I ended up subsequently with a whole career in neuroscience. And of course, George was instrumental in establishing the Functional Imaging Centre at Oxford, and he was key to my return from the USA to help Paul Matthews, who will speak a little bit later, to help get that off the ground. So many years later, he actually became also my head of department for a brief period, and we interacted frequently during my tenure as head of clinical neurosciences, and then as warden of Merton College, which was where I was also an undergraduate and graduate, so we shared that link as well, although women were not there when George was an undergraduate, but they subsequently let us in, and the sky did not fall down, so we carried on going, and I was very lucky to be an alumni, and then I subsequently returned and became warden of Merton College, and that was a real treat to connect with George again at that moment, and he never ceased in all those years to being just an extraordinary mentor, And I know that that's the case for many others who, in preparation for his funeral and the eulogy, gave me so much wonderful stories and insights about how he touched their lives as well, and just how he continued beyond those years where he was your supervisor to always be there and always be a mentor for people around the globe. My aim, during my tenure at Warden at Merton College, I knew that George was really keen to come back in. It was a college that, of course, was instrumental in him being able to move to the UK and to study. And it was by meeting in Austria, in Vienna, some Merton Fellows that started that journey and that opportunity for him. And he never forgot that, and I don't think he ever, lost his love. And it's wonderful to think that he's buried there physically in the grounds of the college that he loves so much. So it was a real hope for me as I started my tenure that I could get George and Sue back to the college, and we would facilitate that. We had him to our home, did we not, Miles? And we managed to choreograph that with obviously Sue's disability. And then the next step was to try and get him into the college. But then COVID hit, and that just completely ruined that opportunity. But it was lovely to have him connected, and we did some Zoom calls with other fellows over bottles of wine, and we did a few things where we got him back into the fellowship and he could enjoy the comradeship that he had enjoyed so much. And I know that it meant a lot to him because of its role being so instrumental to him during those difficult, dark days when he had to leave his homeland here. I last saw George and Sue not as recently as you did before his sad passing, but it was just before I became Vice-Chancellor at the beginning of 2023, just over that December period. I started my role at the beginning of January 23, and I went out to visit them in Whitney, and we had a wonderful visit, and it was, again, I concur, he never lost the sharpness of his mind, and his interrogation was there. Why on earth did I want to take on the role of running the institution? So he was always absolutely on it, and we had some wonderful discussions and exchanged some books. And then we kept in touch by email subsequently during that tenure, and I was sharing my updates about how I was finding the role and who was driving me crazy and how to manage that. And I think he found it very humorous that I'd taken on this role, but he was very always enthusiastic and supportive. So as we are hearing, and we will hear, I'm sure, throughout the day, George was very many things. He was a scientist, he was a mentor, he was a leader, he was a colleague, and he was a friend, in addition to, of course, his role as a wonderful father and husband. He blended these qualities magically. I don't quite know how he did it, but he did really blend all those roles together with an extraordinary mix of characteristics and talents. He had boundless kindness and generosity. Why are we all here today? It was because of that generosity and that kindness that he extended throughout his whole life to us that makes us want to always remember George and honour him. He had a brilliant intellect, an energy and work ethic that was completely indefatigable. He had a natural and irrepressible curiosity right to the last day for science, and just an absolute love of science and discovery. And I think it is fair to say, and I hope you agree with me, that in his mind all of that was made possible because of the people that delivered it. He was very much a people person. It was all about the people with George. And despite all the awards and the gongs and the sort of various medals and things and prizes that he won, he was always very, very honest and clear about the fact that it was his students, his postdocs, his senior staff, his support staff that he was most proud of. And he genuinely followed their stories and kept in touch, as I've mentioned, throughout their both careers academically, but also their personal lives. He was as interested in what Miles was doing and our children were doing as he was in what we were doing with our careers scientifically. Going back to sort of what was it like to be a PhD student of George, well, it was just always great fun, frankly, in the Radda lab. It was just this extraordinary circus come cabaret. The annual retreats, I don't think any of us will ever forget. He would take us all off at great expense, and we'd go off into the countryside, just outside of Oxford, to a very small village called Charlbury, and these were epic events. Mornings were spent where we were terrified because we had to go up in front of a room full of people. There's probably triple the number of people here in his research team, and we would present. George would be sitting where you are, Silvestri, with endless notebooks, which he would be scribbling absolutely everything that was being said, and then he would interrogate you during those processes. So it was a sort of baptism of fire to get through those. So George would be scribbling away. It was just these extraordinary moments where not only did we do the great science in the morning, and we sort of gritted our way through it, but he then always made sure in the afternoon and the evenings it was pure fun. So then we got the opportunity to go out either gliding in aeroplanes, or we went horseback riding, or we went for nature walks. And then there was some pretty heroic parties in the evening until the small hours, and then the next morning you had to get up with a hangover and present your science once more. So these were things to endure and get through, but they were just fantastic. And we all just took it for granted that that was perfectly normal. Every research team works like this, and this was the way science is done. But subsequently, of course, in our own careers and in other experiences, postdocs, we learned that that was not, and that was very, very special at that time and still to this day. But it left such a lasting impression. And it also left a deep impression that great and serendipitous science happens through those human relations. It is all about the relations and the people and the connections, and that if you don't create the time and the space for that, with fun wrapped around it, for those to happen, you weren't going to get the innovative ideas, and you won't get that cross interdisciplinarity of communication and just the serendipity of what might spark and happen. And he knew how important it was to create the space and time to do that. And I think it's fitting that we're doing that today, here, now, precisely as though he would want to. So he had that extremely rare combination, as I say, blending all those extraordinary talents, but I do think probably forged by experiences that I can only imagine in his early years, that he had this extremely rare combination of being hugely successful as a scientist in a really competitive environment and landscape, but with a deep compassion and empathy, where it was always, as I say, about the people and looking after them. He was always really good and very careful about finding out what it was you were good at as a student. And then no matter what it was, he worked with it. If it turned out actually you weren't going to be a scientist and that wasn't quite going to be the career you were on, but you were really good at maybe organising the parties or other things, he became really behind you on that, and that became your thing in the lab, and that was what you were sort of celebrated for. And you got your PhD, but you know you were clearly not going to go down that path, but that was okay. And again, to celebrate what the different talents were that people had, and to be authentic about that, again, has left a lasting impression on many people when they reflect back on those points. He never gave up on anyone. I'm grateful to Paul for giving me this little story on George, which also reflects a different side of his competitive spirit. And again, some of you at the funeral will remember I mentioned this and a few other things I've been saying. But thank you, Paul, for this comment, because this was in your day before I joined the lab. But it reflects George's competitive spirit. So he wasn't just competitive scientifically, which he was. He was really competitive when it came to sports as well, but in a good sportsmanlike way. So he challenged, apparently, one afternoon, soon after their arrival, a student in the lab, a great big, tall, swashbuckling Hollywood American competitive swimming athlete who towered over George, was 15 years his junior. George at this point apparently was smoking a packet of cigarettes a day. I never knew George smoked, actually, so that was news to me. But that didn't deter George. He challenged this young lad to a swimming competition. George lost, but apparently only just, and to the awe and surprise of the whole lab, who were out watching this extraordinary spectacle that literally in their wake could only be just there in awe at this huge wash of water flowing over them, but at their supervisor's sporting prowess, which they had no idea he possessed. So again, a small reflection of that, you know, sportsmanlike, the competitiveness, the confidence as well, and also the fun. Why not go and challenge one of your students and have a go? He was also an extraordinary supporter of women in science, and I think he really was ahead of the curve when it came to understanding that real excellence is achieved by being inclusive and diverse. These are very common expressions now, and we tend to focus and celebrate rightly about excellence being met by embracing diversity and making sure that when you've really found all that talent, wherever it is, you allow them to have an experience that is inclusive so you can really maximise their potential and realise that George was ahead, he was decades ahead of current thinking in that regard. And to do that at that time, he really had to be, bold, and he had to stand up for people, and he had to champion them at a time that wasn't normal. And I think, again, in asking people for their reflections, this came through very strongly from, my own experience as a woman in science in early days, but certainly from women older than me who were real trailblazers, and just how instrumental it was for George standing up behind the scenes, championing them, encouraging them, instilling in them that they had the confidence and the ability that they could go for fellowships or positions. He was always able to see things that others would more conventionally miss, and so he was often there quietly behind the scenes, always giving women scientists and clinicians the push and the confidence to go for things that otherwise they didn't feel ready for, and he was always inevitably right. He was confident, and you got that confidence in the lab with him, that he led the field. He was absolutely trailblazing this space. And he passed that confidence on to us all. You were in an environment where you knew you were at the cutting edge of something very exciting, and there was a confidence in the laboratory and in our ability to think confidently about the questions we were asking. But it wasn't with any sense of arrogance or any sense of entitlement. It was more a sense of responsibility and a privilege that if you've got this gift and you've got this environment, you should do something with it for the betterment of society. So he wanted us to have that confidence to think for ourselves, to be proactive, to ask the difficult questions, not to be frightened of debate and disagreement, all those good things, but always to sort of follow that curiosity and passion and not to do it with any sense of arrogance or entitlement, and with that purpose of, again, trying to put more into the world than you take out and use those gifts that, again, either you naturally have and then have been enhanced by the wonderful schooling that he had and the opportunities that, again, the university gave him. So back in 1966, George, he was appointed to a university lecturer. That was his first sort of tenured post in biochemistry at the university. And at that time, the subject was just defining itself. It was, new and exciting. It was just finding its way. And I think you can look back now and say that, George really was key to shaping the whole field of biochemistry on top of, obviously, the field of NMR. And he continued to really shape that field, I think, throughout his whole career. Understanding membrane proteins and mitochondrial energy, metabolism was his passion. And in 1969, he became part of what we call the Oxford Enzyme Group. And this was a slightly eclectic group of scientists working in NMR and crystallography and computing, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, and clinical biochemistry. It really was an interdisciplinary gathering. And that was, again, ahead of the curve. Before there was even a buzzword of interdisciplinarity, that was what he was doing. And I think that experience of the Oxford Enzyme Group, and certainly talking to Raymond Dweck, who I know would want to be here, and somebody that he worked very closely with, but had an operation, so is unable to travel at the moment, but delighted that this event is happening and sends his very warm wishes. His own view was that was a really instrumental, period for George's thinking about bringing all those different departments together, and was very impressionable on George. And he maintained, that research group thereafter that was always highly interdisciplinary, I think, formed from those experiences. He always blended the physical scientists with the biological and the clinical scientists together to solve the difficult problems. And he was unusual. He ran laboratories, as those who know Oxford and the setup, highly unusually. He ran laboratories up in the hospital and down in the science area, or up and down the hill, as we used to fondly refer to them. And we took it for granted that that was completely normal, that was what people did in biological sciences, but it really was not. And it still, frankly, isn't. And I still think to this day he probably ran the most successful up and down the hill laboratory that the university has seen, really blending the clinical science with the basic science. It was an absolute privilege to be in his lab. It was well funded. It was, as I say, guided by real vision as to what the most exciting things in science were. And I marvel now at his foresight and all those elements that you look back and think about, how he brought all those different communities together, how he would champion people who were not normally being championed, and ultimately that's what led to the excellence that was produced, from his research. As you know, he used phosphorus-31, that was his main thing, nuclear magnetic resonance, to study particularly ATP and metabolic processes. That was sort of how we all cut our teeth and started, and he was very interested in states of ischemia, cancer, metabolic diseases. He applied some of those techniques to study McArdle's disease in 81. So this was a condition affecting muscle energy metabolism. And that innovative application of MR really was a sort of breakthrough moment, because for the first time it showed that we could observe biochemical changes in tissue non-invasively. So for those who are not scientists in the room, you know, to take something out and pop it in a test tube or on a plate and then look at it and then infer what might be going on in vivo, many big steps and assumptions there. How wonderful to just see something in the living. And that was what captivated me in the lecture he gave. It was like, wow, you can do that. You can actually look at biology in the living state without all the caveats and the assumptions. And isn't that a wonderful thing? So that ability to look at things that were going on in the tissues non-invasively, to probe the mechanisms in the living human, and of course that laid the groundwork for the birth of MRI, as you mentioned, the most widely used diagnostic tool. And its use, you know, to this day, and the rest, as they say, is history in regard to that. He also discovered the foundational biology upon which all functional neuroimaging, and I think a lot of people forget that, but Paul, you'll probably mention a bit more on this. So again, you know, doing work that was just pure curiosity-led, just for the interest of really working things out because it was interesting physics and chemistry and biology. But that was the basis of the work that showed that the relaxation times of protons in water could be influenced by the oxygenation state of hemoglobin, and we call this blood oxygen level dependent imaging. And that happened in his lab, it happened in the biochemistry department. Many decades passed before all of these different things could come together, and we could remember that Sherrington, back in Oxford in the Sherrington building, showed us that blood flow and neural activity were coupled. We then had this observation that George and Paul and others had made in the lab, that this was potentially measurable with MR. Then imaging had to be invented, and then the confluence of all that came together and functional imaging was born. And of course, it makes sense then that he was the visionary force after those experiments that actually were sort of pulled together more over in Boston, but all the basics of them were founded in those laboratories in Oxford. But it was no wonder then that many years later, the university and George, you know, was the visionary force with Alan Cowie, John Newsom-Davis, to create FIMRIB, the Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging of the Brain Centre, and for which we are eternally grateful. And of course, there is a room there named after George, which is wonderful, and for many, many generations to come, students will go in there and they'll sit in the George Radda lab and talk science and think and know who that man was and all that he gave, and that's a wonderful thing. So again, the accolades have been mentioned. I just want to make sure that you are all, again, aware of all the wonderful things that, you know, the United Kingdom also did to honour him. He was elected to the Royal Society, the Academy of Medical Sciences. He was a skilled politician as well as an academic leader. And during his 20-year tenure as the British Heart Foundation Professor of Medical Cardiology, he was also head of the Department of Biochemistry in the early 90s. He brought a much-needed period of stability to that department and really set it on its way after a bit of turbulence. He then became Chief Executive of the Medical Research Council in the UK, the main funding body for the United Kingdom for all medical research, both basic and translational, and he had the responsibility of working to make sure that the funding there was put to a good purpose, and an extremely difficult job. And again, that intersection between the scientists as one community you have to talk to, and then the other are the politicians, and George using all the skills of his science brilliance and his leadership and the authority and the gravitas he commanded from the scientific community with his skillful political acumen, again serviced that during a very difficult period really well, and I think history's judged him well in that regard. He was, again, always focused on strengthening, you know, the UK science. He was president of the International Society of Magnetic Resonance Medicine. It was called the Society of Magnetic Resonance Medicine when he was there, subsequently the ISMRM. This is the main body internationally for all the people who work in the magnetic resonance methods to come together and to publish in the journal and to meet at annual meetings and have, again, opportunities to gather and to talk science and to have fun in the evenings. And of course, George did not shirk from his good citizenship responsibilities, and he was president of that society for several years to, again, terrific effect, and they're so proud of him and, again, thinking of ways to honour him. He was appointed, again, Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 93 for services, and then knighted, as you've seen, in 2000. I don't think there was anything left in Britain we could give him to honour him. I think he got everything possibly available. But that didn't end there. You'd think we'd let him just be restful and have some time, but no, we dragged him out of retirement and for 3 years and brought him back to run then the merged department of anatomy and physiology, the Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics, because we needed his help. So we'd created this department. George had been retired for several years, but we needed somebody to come in and again bring all that skill, all that trust that he had built over the many years within the Oxford community, and we knew we could rely on George to come in and help lead that department and set it on its way as a new merged department and calm everybody down and create its identity. And again, deploying all those extraordinary skills during those turbulent waters as he merged that department. And that, again, period just reminded me, having sort of observed him right from undergraduate days, through. I spent a couple of years in the US, but throughout all that period, he was really calm. I mean, you can always see in these photos, he's not one for being effusive with big smiles. I don't know, maybe at home he was a bit more, but he was great fun, but he always had a very calm and very still nature about him, and that was really important, I think, when there was academic storms going on. He always had a very conciliatory approach with colleagues, so he wasn't one to make things worse and stir it up. He was very still, he was very calm, very patient, and again, that kindness and that generosity of being able to be willing to listen, yet with a real firmness about what needed to be done. So he did not shirk or shy away at all. If he had to make a very clear decision, he would, but he somehow did it that you sort of went along with him, a bit like the Irish saying, Irish sort of politician and democracy is telling you you're going to go to hell and you enjoy the ride there. So he had this ability to sort of make you happy about the fact that you're going to have to do something you didn't really want to do, but that was sort of okay. He had a great skill at doing that. And of course we saw that calmness and that patience and that unwavering generosity in all the years that he supported Sue and looked after and cared for her. He was also famously laconic. He wasn't, again, that stillness and calmness. He was, he was proud, I think, of his command of the English language. He was very exacting in his commentary with, when you were writing. So you almost got a sort of English language sort of degree for free during those PhD years, because he was really on you for the way you communicated your science, which I think for a lot of scientists, you just thought data should speak for itself and truth out, and that will do. But he knew if you don't communicate it well and you don't provide a compelling narrative, you're not going to win the story, you're not going to educate people, you're not going to get the grant. This is just the way the world is, and to communicate well. And I guess because he had to learn the language, and in writing, I mean, brilliant. He was a brilliant orator and he was a brilliant writer as well. And he had very exacting standards on us. But he was brief with his words, because he'd think about what he wanted to say and then be very precise about it. So again, other comments that were given to me was, on these termly student reports, you'd have to write about how your students were doing, and normally you're quite verbose and describing them. George would just say, work is proceeding well, full stop. That was it. So most people would give a whole paragraph or half a page. And so the tutor at the college would be, well, is there something going on? Is there more to it? But no, that was it. They're fine. Work's proceeding well. No more to be said. And one of my favourite sayings that George always said, and I've used this many times, and he said, this is a very helpful piece of advice, Irene, I'm going to give you, with that slightly up the corner wry smile, and that is to think twice before you say nothing. And it's brilliant when you think about it. How many times would you put our politicians to think twice before saying nothing? Anyway, advice that I'm using frequently in my day job at the moment. He was, of course, adored for his work in Singapore too, and I know I visited a couple of times as well and gave some lectures there. There's a big sort of pain and neuroscience community, so it was always really great to catch up with him and yourself occasionally there. And of course, it was wonderful that in 2015 they conferred an award to George as an honorary citizen of Singapore, rightly so. He was very proud of the work he did there, and they were very proud of him. And he never, ever lost his love and support of Hungary and the Hungarian science and scientists and academia here. And that's why it's so wonderful to be here today. And I can't thank you enough for including us to be here to celebrate. Of course, he was awarded the Corvin chain. Lovely to see that photograph there. And he understood very clearly what it was to stand on the shoulders of giants. He knew that he was part of this piece of history, and that was his journey, and that was what he was going to put into the world, and then we each do our part, and very much everybody's layering on each other. So he was, really, mindful of the importance of respecting your scientific history and the legacy and where we've come from in the context of that. And I think that's why I interacted and enjoyed Zoltan so much, because of Zoltan's obsession with the history of neuroscience. I know he got a kick out of Zoltan's enthusiasm for that. But even though he had that respect for the past, it was always about the new science, wasn't it? Right to the last moments. It was always that passion for learning, for being curious. And so it was wonderful to see that photo of you all gathering there at that last meeting in the summer of 24 to have a few precious hours with him. And certainly Zoltan said that, he was full of energy, enthusiasm, and coming up with new and excellent ideas on how to invest in future basic science and translation, not only in Hungary and the UK, but across the world. So he was still coming up with ideas as to what we should be doing and how we could be doing better. So just in closing, George is the kind, generous, brilliant, fun, humorous and modest giant upon whose shoulders we all stand. We will never forget him or be able to thank him enough for all he gave to us individually. And of course to his beloved Merton College and to the University of Oxford, to UK and global science, and of course for his faithful devotion to Hungarian science and academia. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And now, as I told you before, Mr. Mark Radda, son of George Radda, is here with us online. So I kindly ask him to talk about his respected father now.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Radda, and George Radda was my father. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today to celebrate his life. And I'm speaking on behalf of all three of his children. My sister Anne and my brother Jonathan are with you in person today. And I'm very sorry that I can't be with you and instead am having to join like this. But unfortunately, I've had a heart infection and I am, rather ironically, waiting for an MRI scan. I didn't anticipate that MRI would stop me attending my father's own memorial symposium. I must say, it's a strange thing being the children of a famous scientist and someone with such an amazing story, because to us, Dad was Dad. We didn't really see him as this important person dealing with world leaders, noted scientists, or famous people. We saw him as our dad. He was the person who'd help us with our school homework, who'd occasionally give us our 50p pocket money, he'd drive us to university, he'd support us in our careers. And he wasn't, to us, a person for casual conversation. He never really sat down and told us much about himself, even in later life when we asked him directly. So we've mainly learnt about him from other people and the stories they'd tell us. And it's been so interesting learning more since he passed away last year. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what people share today, and I'm really sad that I'm not with you to chat in person. So I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so telling you a little bit about our childhood and what it was like to have Sir George Radda, or Dad as we called him, as our father. But before I describe our life with Dad, let's rewind a little bit to explain how he arrived in the UK. As you know, my father left Hungary in 1956. He escaped over the border to Austria, and he made it to Vienna, where he was met by two professors from Oxford University. They spoke to him in German, and they offered him the opportunity to be interviewed for a place at Oxford. And the next evening, he found himself on a flight to the UK organised by the British Red Cross. Arriving in the UK, he was taken to Merton College, and there he was interviewed by a chemistry tutor. Now, the chemistry tutor was unable to speak Hungarian, and my father was unable to speak English, so they communicated using the periodic table as a common language. The tutor could clearly see Dad's potential, and he was very quickly offered a place at Merton, on the condition that he learnt English in 3 months, which, Dad being Dad, he managed. He lodged in a boarding house in a place called Holywell Street in Oxford, it backed on to a famous pub, the Turf Tavern, which is a very handy location if you want a beer. And it was at that house where he met Mary O'Brien, a student who was studying at St Hugh's. They were married at St Aloysius Church, Oxford, in 1961. Mary is our mother. They didn't stay in Oxford for long. Dad was awarded a Fulbright scholarship and was invited to join Melvin Calvin, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist at the University of California. And my parents travelled there together on the Queen Mary. I think they went steerage class because it was the cheapest option. And they lived in the US from 1962 to 1963 before they returned to the UK to a new position at Oxford and to start a family. Anne was the first to be born, followed by me, and a few years later, Jonathan arrived. We lived as a family at number 1 Mansfield Road in Oxford. It was a large detached house that was over 400 years old in parts, and it wasn't the most modern of houses. It had wood-panelled rooms that were covered in thick white paint. It was also cold and draughty, though Merton College did kindly install some central heating to stop us all freezing. And not having much money, and with even fewer possessions, furnishing such a house was a big, big challenge. But Dad had skills in carpentry, and he built bookshelves, cupboards, a meat safe because we had no fridge, even a farmyard and a doll's house for us to play with as children. He made a nativity scene that would be brought out every Christmas. It had a stable with a straw roof, and it had a light that shone through the window at the back. I think Mum still has that one and sometimes still brings it out at Christmas. In one room of the house, he built a huge bookcase that took up almost an entire wall. And it was only once he'd finished this bookcase that he discovered it was too large to take down the stairs to the room for which it was intended. So it stayed in the sitting room, the room where it was built, and unless someone's chopped it up and taken it away, it's probably still there today. I remember we had a black and white television for all of our childhood, one of those ones with the fake wood surround and the 4 push buttons for the channels. It used to have to warm up, and it had valves that glowed red inside. I remember Dad trying to adjust the aerial and the horizontal hold to get the best picture. I also remember the time that it caught fire, and Dad leapt up and threw it out of the window to avoid the entire house going up in flames. I'm not sure how he explained that to the company that he'd rented the television from, but Dad was always good with words. Dad also used to bring us unusual gifts that he'd found and thought would interest us. I remember him arriving home with a huge metal cash register from the 1940s that was so heavy he had to enlist one of his colleagues from the biochemistry department to carry it in. He also once brought home a collection of Bakelite telephones which were being thrown away, and which we then tried to connect up in the house to create a home intercom. Somehow he managed to find a cement mixer for my brother, which we used to fill up with petrol and crank the handle to get it started. Often the handle would then fly out and hit us in the chest as it got up to speed. This thing was so dangerous, but these were the days before health and safety. And Dad didn't worry about that, as long as we were keeping busy and we were entertained. Another time, he brought us home a hamster, which I believe came from the animal laboratory at the biochemistry department. The hamster, he was a cheery soul. He was a little bit overweight, and we called him Fatty, not the best name. And poor old Fatty, he didn't last long, but he was very spoilt in the time we did have him. We also had several different cars throughout our childhood. A Triumph Herald, made in the UK, a Saab 95, another UK Triumph 1300, and a Volkswagen Passat. And Dad would often spend his Sundays washing these cars, and quite often he would drag us out to come and help. It was strange, because I only found out a few months ago that he was once offered a car by Enzo Ferrari for diagnosing his son's illness using NMR. But Dad typically turned it down. He said he'd already had a car. It was probably the VW. And that was absolutely typical of Dad. The work was the important thing. The car wasn't relevant. And Dad, if you're listening, how come you turned down a Ferrari? And if anyone from the Ferrari family is listening, we would love to take you up on your offer if you'd care to do so. My brother particularly wanted me to mention that Saab because it had a special place in his childhood, even though he doesn't really remember it. Dad bought it new on the 31st of July in 1969, 6 days after Jonathan was born. And about 6 months later, Dad and his parents were involved in an accident and the car was completely wrecked. A police officer at the time told them it's a good thing that they were in the Saab, and they were really, really lucky not to be badly injured or worse. And despite being too young to remember the Saab, Jonathan developed a lifelong passion for the brand and for cars in general, which Dad encouraged. Many years later, Martin Redfern, one of Dad's friends, was selling his Saab 95, the same model we'd so briefly owned. And my brother, then aged 15, encouraged by my dad, bought it for the princely sum of £65. He was obviously too young to drive on a road, but Dad would take him to old airfields and to country tracks to practice driving until he passed his driving test just after his 17th birthday, the first opportunity that he could possibly pass. And Dad encouraged Jonathan in a career in the motor trade. He even found him a garage close to his house, and Jonathan would therefore spend many weekends with Dad, helping him with grass cutting, often ironing the huge pile of shirts that he wore to work, and he also made sure the cars were immaculate and working perfectly. In our childhood, Dad would sometimes take us out for exciting day trips. One particular favourite was to go to Kidlington Airport, which I think is now called Oxford Airport. And there he would give us a bag of crisps, a carton of juice, and we'd sit on a bench and watch the planes take off. Another place we'd go to was the biochemistry department. Not the most exciting of places, but Dad would take us there and we'd draw on the huge blackboards in the lecture theatre. He'd sometimes take us to the animal lab and we'd go and visit and say hello to the rabbits and the mice. We'd also travel up and down in the Paternoster lifts. These are lifts that had no doors, that continuously moved, and you'd have to risk your life jumping in and out. And as a treat, we'd occasionally be allowed a snack from a vending machine. I also remember being taken to see a really early version of an NMR spectroscopy machine where the magnet was just about big enough to put your arm inside. I think that was the same machine that had previously wiped out all of Dad's credit cards and ruined his watch. And at one point, a cleaner got a little bit too close whilst they were polishing the floor, and their polisher took off, flew across the room, and firmly embedded itself into the side of the NMR machine. I remember at the time, Dad was not very pleased, but he did see the funny side, and I remember he had a photograph of this polisher attached to the magnet up on his wall for many years. Dad also used to take us on holidays. We'd stay in the UK, in Derbyshire, the Lake District, and Devon. I also remember him taking us on a road trip to Germany and Austria, where we visited his brother Shippy, his sister Marta, and their families. And I remember getting caught in a huge hailstorm there, where the hail was so big it dented the roof of the car. Christmas was also an important time, and it was a time where Dad brought Hungarian traditions to the house. Our tree was always decorated with what we called Hungarian chocolates, and which apparently are called szalonkukor, but please excuse my pronunciation. And his parents would unfailingly send these over from Hungary. We usually would get 2 boxes, and we'd hang them on the trees. I also remember some were rather less tasty than others. On Christmas Eve, Dad would also cook us a lavish meal. He was a really good cook, and he enjoyed cooking. And this meal usually included a few Hungarian dishes, and we'd open up a few of our presents. Dad would also pretend that Father Christmas was arriving, and he'd ring some sleigh bells in the background. We'd also have a phone call with our grandparents in Hungary, and in those days there was no direct dial, and Dad would arrange a call via the operator. We would take turns saying Merry Christmas to the distant voices of our grandparents, and we'd also watch Dad speaking in Hungarian, which was something we didn't really see very often. I wanted to say that Dad also loved his music. He loved opera, he loved jazz, and he had this huge collection of records and CDs. I remember the excitement when he arrived home with a new music centre, which was a combined record player, tape deck and radio, very expensive for its time. It was a really special thing, and we had to be super careful when we used it. Dad also loved going to the opera and had wonderful memories of his visits to the Hungarian State Opera, particularly the Faust Ball in 2015, and he treasured the photo he had taken there of himself with Eva Martin, who's another Corvin chain holder. I remember when Anne was about 12, she decided to learn the piano, and Dad decided that it was a good idea and he would too. And Dad found a teacher, which conveniently was very close to the laboratories where Dad worked. And Dad was an enthusiastic pupil, and I'll never forget his repeated attempts at playing on the sunny side of the street. We still have the piano book that he used, and ironically, it was called It's Easy to Play Jazz, and it still falls open on that tune. And despite their best efforts, and Dad's later attempt at playing the clarinet, it seems that a talent for playing music really didn't run in the family. Dad was also a father who was always travelling the world at a time when it was both expensive and unusual, and his work took him to many countries, and I remember him being away often. He would bring back gifts from these exotic destinations, and I particularly remember the talking book and some racing cars from America. There were also some chocolates that he got from the Netherlands that were in the shape of windmills and clogs, and he brought back some gifts from Concord, including pens and a tape and a coaster, which I wish I still had. We kind of took it for granted that he travelled the world, and it seemed normal to us. And I guess that may be where I got my love of travel from. And it was one of the few things where we'd sit down and chat about. And I remember boring him with my pictures of the Tanzanian bush and loads of temples in the Guatemalan jungles. Dad's final role took him to Singapore as chairman of the Biomedical Research Council at A-Star. And this was a place and a role that he absolutely loved. Both Anne and I went out to visit him there. And he lived in a really humble flat. It was near the docks, and it was furnished with quite simple furniture. He could have stayed somewhere much more expensive, much more flashy, but he really didn't care. He wasn't there for the flat, he was there for the work. I remember I took him to Raffles, which was a client of mine at the time, for dinner. Had I known that I'd end up paying, I probably would have chosen somewhere a little less expensive. But that's what Dad was like. He didn't think about things like that. Dad also received many awards over the years. He was awarded a CBE in 1993, and Jonathan went with him to Buckingham Palace to see him receive it. His CBE was upgraded, if that's the right word, to a knighthood in 2000, but in typically modest fashion, Dad didn't mention it to me. I remember reading about it in the Sunday Times whilst having a pint in a village pub. He was also thrilled to be made an honorary citizen of Singapore in 2015. Dad was extremely proud to be Hungarian, and we, as his children, are also proud to have had that Hungarian heritage. And I always think it's a shame that we never were taught Hungarian. He was exceptionally proud to be awarded the Corvin Chain in 2018 and delighted that he should be chosen to be part of such an organisation that brings together the best in arts and science. And he was especially pleased that Eva Martin was also a member. I know how much he enjoyed the committee meetings. And I know that he would have been pleased that the Hungarian Research Network and the board of the Hungarian Corvin Chain have organised this event to celebrate his life. Well, I hope that has given you an idea of what Dad was like as a family man. As I said, we're very proud to have had such an influential and significant person as our father. But I think more importantly, we're proud to have had a father who loved us, who supported us, and to help us become who we are. Because that's the Dad we know, that's the Dad we love, and that's the Dad we will remember. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thanks for Mark Radda for sharing his thoughts with us. And finally, I invite on stage Mr. Alistair McGrath, former PhD student of Sir George Radda, professor at the University of Oxford, to deliver his speech.
Well, thank you very much. I first met George Radda in September 1974. Like one of our previous speakers, I had studied chemistry and I was moving into my final year, wondering what to specialize in. And I talked to my tutor at Wadham College, a man called Jeremy Knowles, who went on to be Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at Harvard, about what I should do. I wanted to go into the biomedical sciences. What should I do? But Knowles and I also were having other conversations about whether I could switch from chemistry to do theology. Because I was becoming, I'm always someone who loves both science and humanities. I don't like them being separated. I want to find some way of holding them together. And Knowles and I came to the conclusion, this wasn't going to happen. Let's concentrate on biomedical sciences. And Knowles said, you need to work with George Radda. Why? Because Knowles and Radda both had been member of ROC Norman's research group at Oxford, and they did the PhD fills together. And indeed, during the 1970s, there was even the Knowles-Norman-Radda equation, if you were interested in electrophilic aromatic substitution. So I went to work for George, and I remember very much that meeting in September 1974. I walked into his room in a somewhat derelict department of biochemistry, walked through the door, and there was George sitting at a desk with books all over the place. There were papers on the floor. Obviously, the floor was an admirable filing cabinet. And George was there in this scene of complete chaos, but obviously knew where everything was, because I'm so glad you're here. I've read a paper, and I think you'll like this. And he rummaged around and eventually found it and said, read it and come back to me in the afternoon, we'll talk about it. So I went and read it, and I read it with great appreciation because it was obviously a viable research project. So I went back and said, look, George, this is going to work, it's great. And he said, I knew you'd like it, and he beamed. I think that's the only word I can really use to describe it. He was really, really pleased. And so my research work in this department began. And as many others said before me, it was a very significant group. In my day, it was perhaps rather smaller than it was later, but certainly it was a very collaborative group. We'd had coffee every morning. There'd be weekly research seminars, mainly to keep us up with what each other was doing. But I think the thing I valued most about George was the fact that he was a mentor. He wasn't just about getting your research done. It was all about personal growth. It was about strategizing about what was really important. And I think I learned an awful lot from George during that time. Happily, the research project I was given was very, very successful. With the result that after 3 months, I had enough, actually, to finish work for the whole academic year. And so one of the postdocs in the department and I began to speculate about things we might do together, and we ended up with an independent research project that George thought was really interesting, which ended up with a research paper, which surprised me, but it meant that, in effect, I already had enough for my second part of my chemistry degree, but also the beginnings of a doctorate, which actually would mean that that doctorate was going to take much less time than anyone might have thought. And George found that very exciting. We began work on my DPhil the next year, and a landmark really happened early in the first year of my DPhil, when George, who, as I have said, was a mentor, came and said, Alistair, here's an advertisement. University Gazette was put down on the table in front of me. There are 2 senior scholarships, one at Merton College, one at Christchurch. I want you to apply for both. I'll be your referee, and so will Jeremy Knowles. So go ahead and apply. And I wasn't used to being directed to do things, but you know, George was absolutely clear. You're going to apply for these. These are what you need to be doing. So I did what he told me, and was shortlisted for both positions, and turned up at Merton for the first of these interviews, and it was a disaster. You know, I was torn to pieces by the assembled dons who really showed me how the academic life could be really quite challenging at points. So I went away and thought, right, when Christchurch happens in 2 days' time, I'm going to do better next time round. So I went back to the lab the next day and was walking across the main reception area when there was great excitement in the reception office, and they were banging and saying, Alistair, Merton's on the phone, they want to speak to you urgently. So I went in, and they all gathered around to listen, and I'd been offered senior scholarship at Merton. So I went to George and said, George, I've been offered this senior scholarship at Merton, but the interview was awful. And George said, I heard you did rather well. So I began to realize perhaps academic life wasn't all that I thought it was, that actually you could retrieve something from these things. So anyway, I went to Merton, and that was a pivotal moment. And I want to emphasize this because one of the points I'm going to make is that George Radda is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, influences on my life. Because George, in effect, got me into Merton College, and that was pivotal. Merton, others have said this already, but I'll reinforce it, was a very special place. And as I went there as a senior scholar, I began to experience that kind of interdisciplinarity, which is so important in life. I was talking to historians, to classicists, to everybody, and began to realize that actually I really did want to find a way of bridging with the humanities. I had a conversation very early in the time of that senior scholarship with the person who administered it, and he was giving me his background. It was originally for people who wanted to do either a second first degree or a doctorate. And I very cheekily asked them, could I do both? In other words, could I do my doctorate and at the same time do a first degree in theology? Now, at Oxford, if you already have a degree, you can do a next degree in just 2 years. And there are all kinds of issues, but the big issue was going to be, would George Radda agree to this? So I went to George and I explained to him that I loved science, but I just didn't want to be a scientist on its own. I wanted to have something deeper, something richer. And George told me that something I did not know, that he himself was very interested in humanities. In fact, he had quite an interest in religion, which he kept to himself rather a lot, but nevertheless it was there. And he looked at me and said, Alistair, we will miss you, but you've got to do what you want to do, because if your heart's not in it, it's not going to happen. And I said, well, George, I think this is the way I'm being led. Is this something you feel able to support? And George just leaned forward and said, Alistair, yes, go and do it. So the college very kindly gave me permission, and to cut a very long story short, in the 2 years I was at Merton, I gained my doctorate, thanks to George, in January of my final period at Merton. And then, to my surprise and everybody's surprise, I got the highest marks in theology that year and lots of prizes from the university and the college. So it was a pivotal moment. And the key point I want to make simply is this. George was the guiding hand who brought me on that way. It wasn't necessarily the way that he would have liked, but nevertheless it was a way he enabled. I think that's a very important point to make. Because in effect, George was really the person who gave me that sense of navigation as to how we go ahead. To cut a long story short, I then went on to various things. I ended up with a personal chair in theology at Oxford, and finally in my job there as the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion, which is a wonderful position because it is exactly about this interconnection of the sciences and the humanities in a process of mutual enrichment. And again, I have George to thank for that. I mentioned Jeremy Knowles earlier, and Jeremy Knowles and I met up in 2007. He was visiting Oxford, he insisted on seeing me, and he really wanted to say goodbye because it turned out he had cancer, as you know him. He died in 2008, but he just wanted to say goodbye, and he said, I gather your career has taken some very interesting turns. And he said some nice things, and I began to realize that actually this was goodbye, and I tried to explain to Jeremy why he'd been so helpful to me. And after Knowles' death, I began to think, actually, there is someone else to whom I know even more, and that's George Radda. Now, you may not know this, but George's son was mentioning how the family lived at 1 Mansfield Road. Somebody else resided at 1 Mansfield Road in 1916 as he was going up to be interviewed for studying classics at New College, which is just around the corner. That person is C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis wrote a letter to a friend of his in 1956 to Bede Griffiths. And this is Lewis as an older man looking back on his life. And he writes to his younger friend, who was one of his students, this. It's when you get towards the end of your life and you look backwards that the patterns begin to emerge, that you suddenly see things which just weren't accessible to you as you are actually living the flow of life. In other words, older age is sort of privileged because you can look back and you can see what's happening, you can see the patterns, and you see who really mattered. And I can look back and I can see the pivotal events which made me what I am, for better or worse. And the most important person in all of that was George. George giving me a vision. George giving me permission to make this connection. George in supporting me all the way through what was quite a complex process. And so, really, what I'm saying is, George, I accept fully as a wonderful scientist, but I need to say to you, he was a very, very good supervisor and a splendid human being at helping me become what I am. But I don't end there. Because my wife and I retired to Charlbury, where I gather you have connections. It was a very nice place, and I wondered then, could I reconnect with George? Because I wanted to say to him what I've been saying to you this afternoon. But the problem was, I couldn't find where George was, and I had no email address. And then you, sir, came to the rescue. You said, I think this email will work. And it did, although it took 4 months because George was having real problems with his email. And George said, I would very much like you to have lunch at my retirement home, and gave me great details about how to find the place, although I knew it because we'd lived in Witney, which is where this place was built some time earlier. I went to see George last year, 2024, and we spent 2.5 hours talking. And I have to say, I was worried because, I might be tiring him, but he wanted to talk. He wanted to talk about life, he wanted to talk about religion, he wanted to talk about everything. And as I listened to him and talked to him, I saw again that intelligence, that acumen, that willingness to listen, which I remembered so well from my time as a DPhil student. And we had a very, very special time together. George is obviously much loved. As we walked in, or I walked in, George wheeled into the dining room. Everyone was saying, "Hello, George, how are you, George?" They obviously knew him and liked him. And we parted good friends. And I said, "I come back as soon as I can," but sadly, events got in the way. So really what I'm saying simply is, mine is a tale of George Radda really having a very deep personal influence, which I am delighted to record, and I'm sure many in this room will be able to tell similar or even better stories, but that's the kind of person he was. So thank you, George, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. Thank you.
So everything is settled back, and now I invite Mr. Tibor Radda, nephew of Sir George Radda, to deliver his speech.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry, probably like me, you would prefer to listen more to this amazing music performance than to my words here. But don't worry, it's not about my words. I'm very honored to be here on behalf of my father, István Radda, who is the younger brother of György Radda, Sir George Radda, and I'm happy to read the following lines in his name. Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank President Professor Dr. Szilveszter Vizi and also Professor Dr. Balázs Gulyás for the idea and realization of this unique commemorative event for my brother, Sir George Radda. I would also like to welcome the family, all the distinguished scientists and numerous friends of my brother present here today. I thank you for coming, and I assume that my brother's globally outstanding scientific achievements are widely known enough. Therefore, I will focus to talk a bit about his early years being my brother. From the Benedictine monastery in Pannonhalma to the Merton College in Oxford. Let me begin with a wonderful little detail. In the early 1930s, a young woman studied chemistry at the University of Budapest and became the first woman in Hungary to earn a doctorate in this area. Shortly after, she married and became the mother of my brother George, later Sir George Radda. Thus, the periodic table was practically led in my brother's cradle, something very important for a scientist. At the famous Benedictine High School in Pannonhalma, he already stood out in his early years by quickly and accurately completing his daily homework, to the astonishment of the Benedictine professors, leaving him with plenty of time over the years to engage in various sports. He became national champion in his age group for 100-meter breaststroke and freestyle swimming, which caught Oxford's attention, and was also part of a national championship-winning 4-man rowing team. Fun we had with sports, much fun. During winter, we could sled home from the hill to our house. Of course, football was also a part of our lives, in which George excelled. In his final school years, he was a valued member of the school selection team. He was also an active Hungarian Boy Scout and took part in excursions to the nearby Bokoň forest, which at the time still had a Benedictine monastery. He also greatly enjoyed playing the piano and practiced regularly under the supervision of a Benedictine professor. In the 1950s, the government introduced a national scientific competition for all final year high school students across various subjects. The Benedictine High School in Pannonhalma sent my brother to compete, and he won first place in both chemistry and mathematics. The prize? University admission without entrance exams. This enabled him to begin his studies in Budapest, where he passed the early stages with distinction. While living in Budapest, he received opera and concert tickets from friends, which led him to discover and love classical music. Thanks to the Italian language he had learned in Pannonhalma already, he later visited Italian opera houses whenever possible. After November 1956, he saw his future in the Free West. And with our father's consent, together with my sister, we three fled to Austria. A team of Oxford professors in Vienna deemed my brother sufficiently qualified to continue his studies. Through intense English learning, initially 200 words a day, a professor soon judged his language skill to be sufficient. His studies in Budapest got recognized. He completed his chemistry degree and began his scientific career with great success, which is already widely known and much appreciated. In conclusion, also a unique experience for our family. At the time when my brother completed the prototype of the first magnetic resonance device, he asked my wife, Marika, if she would volunteer to lie inside it without it being turned on. Of course. She immediately agreed and lay down in the machine, which she described as an incredible feeling. According to my brother, she was the first woman in the world to be inside this prototype. His global success, his boundless energy, and humorous conversations will remain unforgettable to me forever. Thank you, George. Köszönöm, György.
I kindly ask now Mr. Paul Matthews, former PhD student of Sir George Radda, director at the Rosalind Franklin Institute, to make his speech.
Thank you. Well, I would like to begin by thanking the Hungarian Corvin chain, HUN-REN, the many friends of George, students, family, and all of us who loved him for allowing me to join you today. It is a great honor for me to remember someone who shaped not only my career, but also the way in which I do what I do and the way in which I think and work. I was reflecting before coming here that at the time of his death last year, I had known George for 46 years. He was my teacher when I was a chemistry Part 2 student, like so many others, DPhil supervisor, mentor and colleague in establishing the Oxford FIMRIB Center, respected leader during his MRC tenure, senior collaborator in trying to organize an innovative molecular imaging effort in Oxford after he left the MRC, advisor during his tenure in Singapore when I was a visiting professor in the LKC School of Medicine, where Balish was, and caring partner while I tried to support his wife, Sue, as her neurologist. At each stage in this life journey for George and for me, he grew in stature in my eyes. As an aspirant but unmade scientist, when I inquired first about coming to George's lab as a Part 2 student, I walked into the same environment that Alistair described so well, absolutely ramshackle laboratory, well beyond the scope of any health and safety provision of the modern era. It was a small open office area, squeezed in between windows stuffed with books and papers. The floor was no less clean when I came in than it was in Alistair's day. Our chairs close, George pulling himself up to me, trying to show me some things on paper. George's utter enthusiasm as he described what had been recent NMR studies with a living ferret's heart. The ability, George said, to watch chemistry, the chemistry of life in real time. For me, a chemist still focused on small 5mm NMR tubes, this seemed so fanciful and exotic that I used it as a tale of almost comical wonder with my fellow students after I accepted the challenge. I didn't know what to expect when I started. I was ignorant in so many ways. However, George treated me from the beginning just as he treated the much more accomplished and gifted. His lab, as Irene has recounted so well, was an extraordinary place for a young scientist to be. He offered suggestions rather than prescribing directions. My suggestion was typically cryptic in a George fashion. He handed me a matchbox containing a folded up piece of paper in which was a hydrophobic dye derivative of umbelliferone, and he suggested that I explore biological membrane surface potential because this was potentially a pH-dependent distribution dye. I was just allowed to get on with it. I didn't really speak to him about the project for some weeks after that, but it was incredibly exciting because not only was I being given the privilege of acting as a scientist, but it also allowed me to take on something that, if it had all worked out in the best of all possible ways, would have directly tested the alternative hypotheses of mitochondrial function at the time, one by George's teacher, RJP or Bob Williams at Wadham, and the other by the later Nobel Prize-winning Peter Mitchell about the way mitochondria worked. Well, as time went on in the lab, it transpired that George was a very busy man. The way he operated is he was absolutely enthusiastic, but engaged serially by the most cutting-edge work in the lab, and otherwise quiet and supportive, if detached. This worked as a strategy for me, anyway. The opportunity to explore, given by his relative freedom, and the incentive to do something that finally caught his attention was a powerful motivator, as was the chance to, Irene recalled how formidable it was to have George sitting right there, as was the chance to successfully parry his then seemingly remarkable ability to ask a question that drilled immediately to the heart of whatever problem it was that we were describing. George's intellect in the lab was a legend. From his arrival at Merton, where I recall hearing, I think it was probably from Sue, that George was learning 200 words in English per night in order to get through those difficult first 3 months, 100 of them, George said, in the bath, where he kept warm with the words on little cards in front of him. George moved from this through the Oxford chemistry course, making it without English in the beginning to be a stunning success. And that was really extraordinary because Oxford's chemistry, like all of the other subjects in Oxford, involved writing an essay or two per week, longhand, which for someone just learning how to speak the language was an extraordinary feat. George later said that he spent the first essay, pre-essay night, up for the entire night, looking up almost every word in the dictionary before laboriously putting it down. His early work with Dick Norman, his tutor at Merton, made a significant impact in synthetic organic chemistry with his Part 2 and DPhil, something that very few students actually manage. He produced extraordinarily, even for a chemist, somewhere between 8 and 10 papers from those first 3 years as a DPhil student. And I went back and looked at his first paper, and this is really remarkable given his later career as a physiologist. His first paper was in the Advances in Heterocyclic Chemistry in 1963, Free Radical Substitutions of Heteroaromatic Compounds. George loved science. He was co-authoring scientific papers up until 2020, and I think, Balash, that the paper that you showed on the screen was his last collaborative paper. Well, we all see George through different eyes. Now his academic peers in the UK know him probably best as a pioneer of magnetic resonance spectroscopy. He really established the field of magnetic resonance spectroscopy at a time when there were only about 3 prominent groups in the world. George was one of the first to apply it and really the first to have the big vision of carrying it from a preclinical domain to human studies. His work enabled the broad spectrum characterization across different sorts of molecules of cell metabolism. And as we've heard from a number of speakers today, it's revolutionized the way in which researchers around the world now still are thinking of studying and in a few cases clinically implementing tools for studying heart failure, cancer, diabetes, even brain disease. There were 2 critical events during my period in George's lab, which was a time of incredible fecundity for that lab between 1977 and 1983. The first was work, as Irene referred to, that was led by Keith Thorburn, an Australian biochemist who was visiting the lab, on oxygenation-dependent blood-water signal. Now that sounds very dry, but what Keith was picking up on, again, in this incredible ferment of ideas in Oxford at the time and the openness of George's lab to let people follow their nose, Keith had the vision that he heard about this method that one of the labs downstairs had discovered to study the way in which water existed in red blood cells. And what they found is that when red blood cells were deoxygenated, the signal outside of the red blood cells in the bulk blood just completely disappeared. And then when it was oxygenated, you could see it again. Now that simple observation, which was being used to study the biochemistry inside the cell, Keith realized you might be able to use it to get a dynamic readout of blood oxygenation in a human or animal. And he picked up this idea, and with John Waterton, Keith, and I developed a notion that we could use this signal to look at serial blood oxygenation and deoxygenation in living tissue, which George immediately got excited about, and somewhat later, one of the really founding father of functional magnetic resonance imaging picked up, developed one step further as the instrumentation had gone forward, and that was the birth of functional magnetic resonance imaging. And it all came out of George's lab and the freedom that George gave to his people to follow their nose. And the second one was a similar sort of story. When we were in George's lab, there was a single instrument so dangerous that it's hard even to recount it without cringing. And it was so dangerous because it was a high power voltage It was a high-power instrument for NMR, and it was all on open chassis. And to make things worse, not only was it on open chassis as we walked around the room, but we were performing experiments with living tissue next to it, which had to be perfused and then washed with gallons of water. So there was saline here, and then about here was this high-power chassis, all open, and water was flying everywhere at various points during the day. And on top of that, because everyone wanted to use the instrument, we worked on a 24-hour schedule. So we would work through the night, obviously getting more and more tired at various points, and then in the morning we're cleaning this out in this incredibly dangerous environment. I only had a shock once, and it reminded me that I should never do that again, which is wash with saline in one hand and touch the chassis with another. But the real story about this was that I was coming on early in the morning, and Joe Ackerman was coming off the instrument. He'd been working with a scientist in the lab at the time, Gordon Wong, and they'd been studying kidneys. And what they would do is they would take a solenoidal coil. We used to call them Oxford Quick coils, and they were just wraps of copper wire that nowadays you buy from an instrument manufacturer for about £10,000. In those days, we'd wrap them for about 50 pence. Anyway, they would open the animal, wrap this coil around the kidney, and then take the NMR spectrum and what they discovered is that there was a molecule called phosphocreatine, which seemed to always be abundant in the kidney. And the extraordinary thing about that is they knew from biochemical studies that it was a muscle molecule, not a kidney molecule. And they thought about it, and so they said, well, we've got to figure this out. And so they did the obvious, but incredibly non-intuitive experiment of just taking the kidney out and putting the coil in where the kidney was with nothing inside and asking if they could see a signal. And they did. And rather than despairing that something was amiss, they realized that this must be coming from the fact that the coil, which was over the kidney, was also abutting the diaphragm up here. And they were getting signal from the muscle inside the animal. And then they had the inspiration, and this was all in a flash, in 2 or 3 hours, that the signal must be coming because the solenoidal coil field was emanating outside. And Gordon Wong came up with the extraordinary notion was, well, why do we have a solenoidal coil? Let's just squash it. And they tried that because Oxford Quick coils could be made in about 30 seconds. They wrapped another coil, tested it, and then by 9 o'clock that morning, when I came on from my experiment, they were running down to George's office, showing him these spectra and showing that with a solenoidal coil placed on the muscle, they could get a decent signal from the phosphocreatine. The surface coil was born. It was published in Nature about a month later. It is George, to my knowledge, it is George's most cited work. The only fly in the ointment was that the MRC at the time, this was before George's leadership of the MRC, in their wisdom decided that it was unpatentable and that they should just publish this. This is now one of the biggest selling tools that as an adjunct to MRI systems in the market today. And George, Gordon, Joe, the MRC, the university would all be very much wealthier now if history had been different. But it was in fact later that he did go on to head the Medical Research Council, as you've heard, and he started taking a major role in shaping national biomedical research policy at a time when funding was becoming ever more squeezed. He championed two big things as broad principles. One was working together. He tried to force scientists to think about ways in which they could work more effectively together. And he also pushed the concept, as we've heard from his reading of Vannevar Bush and others, of translational research. He thought there was a duty that scientists had to society to translate their ideas into things that improve the lives of the people. But less well known is that it was George, during his time as MRC chief executive, who helped to conceive, fund, and establish the UK Biobank. This was a study, highly controversial at the time, which drew on the rich diversity of the population in the UK, with over 500,000 people enrolled, that is, who have agreed to be followed for the rest of their lives through all of their medical data and to take part in serial investigations. It's been running now for 20 years, and it's considered one of the most valuable resources for epidemiological and genomic research in the world, thanks to its depth, scale, and longitudinal design. And in addition, from about 2007, the chief executive, Rory Collins, came to me and said, well, we really need to do something big. Let's try to add imaging onto it. And of course, most of us are never as perspicacious as the true visionary. I said, that will be really, really difficult, Rory. It just is too finicky to study individual people in depth, and certainly we can't do functional magnetic resonance imaging. Well, Rory convinced me, and to at least take this on, and we held meetings with over 100 scientists from around the world, and over a period of about 3 years developed the concept of imaging 100,000 people in UK Biobank, brains, hearts, bodies, bones, carotids, and capturing more granular data on them. And I'm pleased to say, and it's a fitting tribute to George's vision, that 2 weeks ago, the study completed its 100,000th individual. All of the data from all of the participants is available openly to scientists across the world, and it has become, along with the genetic data that is also in UK Biobank, one of the most widely used parts of this extraordinary resource. George also played a key role when he was MRC chief, just as he was moving into the MRC, in promoting interdisciplinary research of the type that led to the creation of the Oxford Centre for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging of the Brain, or FIMRIB, which is now a world-renowned imaging centre, and he helped to recruit me back from Canada to lead it, and then Irene from Harvard to come in and join me and really help set this up, and then she became my successor when I moved on to GSK. This centre, I think it is not unfair to say, helped to cement Oxford's reputation as a hub for cutting-edge neuroscience and imaging research internationally. Most of us will feel fortunate to have had a career. George actually had at least two, because he went on from this to make contributions to science policy and international collaboration on a much larger scale. He always had advocated for international scientific collaboration, particularly between the UK and European countries, including Hungary. And after retiring from MRC, he continued to work on science policy and capacity building, notably, as we've heard, in Singapore, where he chaired the Biomedical Research Council, and where he's still remembered. I went back frequently to meet with Balish and others as a major influence driving translational discovery there. George actually felt this latter part of his career was the work that defined his major legacy to science, despite all of the achievements of the former. He really believed in international science. Now, as this event shows us, in Hungary, he's long been held in exceptionally high esteem as both a proud son of the nation and as a global scientific pioneer. And I remember I just joined the lab in 1977 when George's father died, and George wanted to come back to Hungary. It was a time that was very uncertain whether George would come back and be arrested as a deserting officer in the Hungarian army in a challenging regime. But he decided he had to go anyway because he so loved Hungary, and of course he so loved his father. He let the Royal Society and all of the academic societies in the UK know about this, despite the admonitions from the Foreign Office not to go. And he came, and it was a really important period for him. He had an extraordinary rapprochement with the country that he'd left so long ago. And since then, as we've heard today, his Hungarian identity remained a great source of pride and admiration, which he wore very openly, as he was awarded the Hungarian Corvin chain in 2018, the Middle Cross of the Hungarian Order of Merit, and he fostered strong academic ties with Hungary and countries like the UK and Singapore through HUN-REN, President Balázs Gulyás's efforts. George's story, from fleeing a repressive regime to knighthood, leading the UK's MRC, embodies resilience and intellectual achievement. He is, for you in Hungary, for us in Britain, a national role model. It's timely, however, in these difficult times in which we are living, to recall George's own reflections on the importance of immigrant scientists. How much UK science, physics, chemistry, his own biochemistry, and the arts in the 20th century has benefited from the open welcome that the UK provided to intellectuals fleeing oppression or persecution across the world, and particularly in Europe during that awful period of the Second World War and what came after. I wish we could all remember that now. However, what is most extraordinary to me to reflect on as I stand here is how closely my life became entwined with aspects of his own, something I didn't think about until the last few days. I owe my career in large measure to his early support. He was the second person, after only Sue, then his secretary, with whom I shared the news that I was to marry Catherine, my wife, at the end of my DPhil. When I moved to Stanford after that to study medicine, soon George, who had been asked to advise the medical school there on MRI, brought me into the discussions, and I was elevated in the eyes of senior academics in the medical school from being a mere medical student to someone worthy of soon thereafter being asked to join the faculty on the basis of my expertise. I didn't take that, but George then helped to lead me into a fellowship in genetics, which is what I wanted to begin to merge my studies with. And he helped me to pull together imaging with this in the early days of the Finbridge Centre and UK Biobank. George himself was unafraid to venture into new areas of science. Part of it was that he just knew a lot, and his breadth of application was maybe, perhaps, less daunting. But what I remember was not that so much as it wasn't just how much he knew, but how he made others feel that they too could learn and become capable of knowing just like him. That must be something that the school gave him, and it's an extraordinary gift. As Irene has highlighted, and Alistair, George was often quiet in meetings. I was always waiting to hear what he was going to say. He had that most exciting form of scientific brilliance. That's why it was worth listening to, because he typically was the first to see the big relationships between ideas. And in a town of brilliant and often intolerant genius, I realized over time also what immense intellectual generosity George had, and he afforded to all of his students. He didn't feel the need to demonstrate his own excellence. He asked meaningful questions. He listened carefully, and he always made you feel that your thoughts mattered. I realized how integral this was to his character as I learned how popular he was with the staff in the MRC. They appreciated his generosity towards their ideas and his willingness to support and recognize their roles, whatever their levels in the organization, not something they received from most academic chief executives. The most memorable aspect of his teaching for me specifically was his insistence on quantitative data. He was a chemist. He wanted to know how much was converted, what the efficiencies of reactions were, alternative directions for synthesis, whether it was in a test tube or in an organ. This was the basis of his enthusiasm for MR spectroscopy, the ability to define amounts, kinetics, quantitative relationships with physiology. It left him behind for a time as MRI, as an imaging technique, qualitatively just exploded around him. But that field has now caught up with him, as we now are beginning to go back and turn even shapes, sizes, and colors into numbers. What was George himself most proud of? His work changed how we see the human body, but perhaps even more importantly, it changed how we see ourselves as individually capable scientists able to cross traditional fields of inquiry and have grand visions for where science could take us as part of an international scientific enterprise. At least so I thought. One day when we met in Singapore, I asked George to tell me what he truly was most proud of. Initially, it surprised me, as I thought of so many specific things, many of which I've just described, that he had accomplished. None of these he cited. Instead, he simply said that he was most proud for having helped his students and for what they had done. I will always be grateful for his generosity, his early belief in me, and the example of fundamental integrity that he lived by. Though he's no longer with us, for the many of us who have had the privilege of having been his students, he leaves a legacy that lives on in what we dare to do, in the way we approach problems, and in how we support others on their own journeys. Thank you, George. You will be deeply missed and never forgotten.
And now please watch the video message of Professor Zoltán Molnár, former colleague of Sir George Radda at Merton College, professor at the University of Oxford.
I would like to say thanks to Balázs for giving me this opportunity to remember Sir George Radda. And I collected a couple of slides from this time, and hopefully this will work. So Sir George Radda and my career have very interesting interactions, and I owe a lot to Sir George. We met in 4 different capacities while we were both at Oxford. The first one was that we both ended up at Merton College. As you know, Sir George studied there, did his graduate studies, and then he was a professorial fellow. And I joined the college as a junior research fellow, and this is where we interacted. We also interacted on UK-Hungary scientific meetings, which Sir George organized and very kindly invited me. We also interacted about the Medical Research Council, where he was the head of this organization, and I was member of the Neuroscience and Mental Health Board. Then, at some point, he was also head of my department, and in fact, I owe the title professor to Sir George, because he nominated me for this when I was contemplating taking a chair at King's, so I stayed at Oxford. And then also we interacted quite a bit on the Sherrington legacy. So Merton College, it's a fascinating college. You probably heard quite a lot about this already from Irene. And it's one of the oldest colleges, and the science and history is oozing from the place. So I joined this college after my PhD as a junior research fellow, and this is where my room was. And I was very lucky because my girlfriend at the time and now wife lived just opposite in this quadrangle. And in fact, this was the room where Irene also stayed before Nadia, my wife. So we received quite a lot of phone calls looking for Irene when she left for Harvard at Boston. So Sir George and I met on lots of governing body meetings. He was very sharp, razor sharp, and he could swing an argument very fast with logic. And this is one of the pictures I found where we are both made it to the annual fellows photographs. Merton, opposite Merton, there is a house where Thomas Willis worked called Beam Hall, and this is the house where the cerebri anatomy was published in 1664. And actually, the word neurology comes from this building. So, and next to this building was also William Harvey's house, where he was for a short period. He was also warden of Merton College. So this street inspired us, and I had lots of discussions with Sir George about neuroscience, neurology, but he was looking at the brain through different eyes. I was looking at the brain, looking at the comparative aspects, evolution, circuitry, whereas he was looking at the brain as a metabolic organ, with membranes, barriers. So this is why we had very interesting interactions. And he was also one of the founders of how to image the body and also the brain. And this is so beautiful about these collegiate interactions, that different disciplines interact, looking at the same organ with very different ideas. And I really appreciated that with Sir George. Now, as you probably heard from Balázs, Sir George was educated at Pannonhalma, and they start very early there. So I also noticed that Sir George's Mini was always the first car parked in the science department. In those days, you could still park there, not anymore. And so he was a very early riser, and he usually had lots of meetings before the others entered the department. So I did my PhD opposite the biochemistry department. Now we have a new department there, this glass building. So this is where I did my PhD. So I kept in touch with him, although I joined a different department and different college. So I joined St. John's College as a tutor, and so I left Merton, and also I joined a different department, the Department of Human Anatomy, where I was first appointed. Now, it turns out that they wanted to merge physiology and anatomy, and they were looking for a strong leader, and it was Sir George who was appointed to do this very delicate operation, and it worked extremely well. Now we have a Department of Physiology, Anatomy, and Genetics, and based on the university rankings, we are doing quite well. Now, and the success is probably due to Sir George's foundations which he laid down for this department. So the advantage of being in this department is that you have cardiovascular science, molecular cellular neuroscience, systems neuroscience, all together in one single department. And it was Sir George who coined the term for the Center of Integrative Neuroscience should be given to one wing of the building. And in fact, this is the title of one of Sherrington's books. And Sir George, of course, read Sherrington, and it was very fitting to name this department using the term integrative neuroscience based on Sir Charles Scott Sherrington's book. Now, as you know, Sherrington described synaptic action, had major contribution to tone and posture, and reciprocal innervation of the muscles and the nerves, and also the foundations of imaging was also laid down by Sherrington by emphasizing the regulation of blood supply to the brain and the changes with activity. So one day, Sir George asked me to come to his office, and he handed me this box of histological slides. So he was cleaning up the office because the previous head of department was my supervisor, Sir Colin Blakemore, and so I helped Sir George to clean up the office. And so this box was very interesting because this box contained all the histological sections of Sir Charles Sherrington. And this contained very interesting histological sections from his medical studies. He has some presents from Santiago Ramón y Cajal. I identified 3 sections, which is from there, Ruffini, and also from Fritsch and Hitzig and others, which he received. So the quality of these sections is incredible. So I'm very grateful to Sir George to give me this box, and I now scanned in these sections, and I also established a website where everybody can actually have a look. It also gave me the opportunity to talk to some of the lecturers who worked with Sherrington and Eccles, like Marianne Fillens, and we identified the sources of some of these sections, and I just show you 1 or 2. So with Eccles, Sherrington looked at the nerves and described what is the consequence of the dorsal root ganglion lesion, and he identified there is an afferent connectivity in the brain. So I'm very grateful for Sir George for giving me this box. It was my hobby over the last 25 years to look at these sections and look at the muscle spindles and also the Ruffini endings, which actually came from the finger of Ruffini himself, and cut it out after he had some sensations, and then sent it to Sherrington to look at these nerve endings. So Sir George Radda was very interested in the history of neuroscience, and he was very sensitive how to handle this. So in our department, we kept most of this legacy. So this is the desk of Sherrington, and also we call the Sherrington, the library, Sherrington Library. And some of these material are now archived, and they are accessible for people around the world. Some of the buildings, unfortunately, have been demolished, and to give way to new purposely built new departments. So I also interacted with Sir George on scientific meetings between Hungary and the UK. So he did that when some contacts were badly needed between the 2 countries, and he involved the Hungarian Academy into these. And I was very fortunate that he also invited me to these meetings. When he listened to my talks, he had always had very interesting feedback. So, for instance, I have been looking at the genes which are expressed in the developing mouse and the developing chick brain, and I have been looking at comparing the cell groups based on their gene expression, so the transcriptome. And Sir George told me that it's not enough just to look at that. I should go on protein level, because some of these cells, they interact with the others through releasing proteins in different manner, in autocrine, paracrine, endocrine manner. And usually these proteins act on cells which actually far away or not obvious to contact. And in fact, this started a research which is still going on in my laboratory, how these transient developing circuits interact. And now we are looking at not only the transcriptome, but also the released proteins. And we look at the mismatch between the translation and the transcription. And this is how we discovered that the thalamus has a major role in the building of your cerebral cortex. Balázs, the last time we met Sir George was during a visit with Balázs and his colleagues, and Sir George was in an excellent mood. He told us that the only reason why he is in that care home is to look after his wife, and he felt absolutely fit, and we had very interesting discussions about the future of funding mechanisms for the UK and also Hungary. So he was full of energy, enthusiasm, and was coming up with excellent ideas how to invest into the future of basic and translational research, not only in Hungary and UK, but across the world. So he kept very active to the very end. And we were all surprised of his death on 13th of September 2024. Now, the funeral was a very solemn and very nice occasion, and we say thanks to Irene, the vice chancellor and also the ex-warden of Merton College for organizing it there. So we even had a speech from Pannonhalma, actually in Hungarian, which was very touching. And it was a nice occasion when I could also meet members of the Radda family and also his colleagues. And I'm very grateful that I could interact with Sir George during my time in Oxford. And he was an exceptional, great man. So he was a highly inspirational and visionary colleague. His impact on the UK and Hungarian science will live with us. Thank you for your attention.
I kindly invite Mr. László Tringer, childhood friend of Sir George Radda, Professor Emeritus at Semmelweis University, to share his thoughts and memories.
Dear friend, I have written some memories from the early times when we aspired the same air in Pannonhalma and even in Győr-Szent Márton. I was the classmate of the younger Radda, István Radda, or among us, Shipi. That was his name. I found some memories which I have written to be quite sure not to speak too long as old persons used to do. They start to tell stories, but it never ends. So I can recall my childhood and youth memories in mosaics. I had a close relationship with the younger brother of the famous Gyuri in Hungarian, George, who was 2 years older than me and already a high school student. That means that in Pannonhalma, but the Benedictine High School. We were, the István and myself, in the elementary school, 8th year probably. His younger brother, István, was my climate, as I have mentioned, and later we attended the Pannonhalma High School in common. We were in parallel classes, not in the same, but in parallel classes. I can place my mosaic-like memories in the village society of the first half of the 50s. As far as I know, the Radda family came to Győr-Szent Márton, that was the name of the village, before being transformed to Pannonhalma, in the context of the post-war violent social transformation, where they were disposed from the village, from the city to village, as many of intellectual families, like in Győr-Szent Márton, Pannonhalma, the family Vékár, you know quite well. In this way, their family was classified as a part of the village's essentially non-existent so-called petit bourgeois, also stratum of the village. According to public opinion, that he are the bourgeois or living in the city of the village, and other part of the population living in the village itself. The village, Győr-Szent Márton, was renamed, as I have mentioned, Pannonhalma later from 64, taking over the historical name of the Benedictine monastery above the village, and became later city of Pannonhalma. Nowadays it's a city. George Radda's younger brother, Istvan, who was 2 years younger than George, was among the best students in our common class. I must guess I myself as well. So we were the two heads of the class. Not coincidence that we were a bit rivals. And this rivalry divided a bit the class itself, the population of the class. So there was some tension despite the friendship we had. The cream of the village, also the best students, continued their studies in the local Benedictine monastery high school. They were called, those who came from the village, every day went above to the monastery. There was the walkers, in contrast to those who lived in the dormitory of the monastery, who were called residents. So residents and walkers, also a conflict source. The majority of the walkers, the villagers, were placed in the real science class. That was also a division, real science and humanities, two types of classes. The majority of workers were placed so in real science class, including myself. The so-called bourgeois stratum tended to attend the humanities class. In this class there were a lot of aristocratic families coming from all the country. The 8-year study of the gymnasium, so the high school, was reduced to 4 years in that time. Our generation, my and Istvan, were those who just have changed the system. So George has started the 8-year class. Against the backdrop of all these school years, George Radda Jury appears as an outstanding older schoolmate surrounded by an atmosphere of authority. It's real and authoritarian impression we younger had of him. Personal contact with him was established for me mainly through his younger brother Istvan. One recurring memory is playing football after school, for which the garden of the teacher's house where they lived was excellently suited. Although I did not like very much football, but to be 11 I had to join also after the classes. Our classmate Laszlo Vida, who is living, not here, he remembers quite well because he lived closer to the Radda family as myself, for example. Once after school, we went to Radda's house, presumably to play. Ourselves being 12, 13 years old, why would I have gone through the regular gate? I climbed over the fence to enter the court. Yes, but as soon as I fell to the ground, the house's dog, otherwise very peaceful, was waiting there. No word, no barking. He bit my thigh immediately. We went to the Radda's family, all the family ran together to give me first aids. In that time, of course, there was no talk about rabies vaccination or so. I still proudly wear the mark of this visit and the sign of this unfriendly welcome. Another now mosaic-like memory I have of Jury Radda is that being very diligent, he studied even when we, the younger ones, were playing. And I remember I looked at the table, what he was doing. And he was just drawing the map of South America. I remember quite well, because the drawing was so beautifully colored that I never forget the shape of South America after George's drawing. Another mosaic. I have Jury Radda and the family is a kind of a party. When Radda's mother invited István's class to an afternoon party with a short snack they offered us. Not to remember, we were in 1950 or 51. So the supply of the population in that time very poor. So in the magazines there was nothing to get except all the families in the village had to supply themselves around the houses to produce food to live. So that party was excellent because we've got a lot of food we had not before. For example, I've got a cream bread with liver cream, which I encountered the first time in my life, and I found it very bad tasting. And I was not a user of that. Jury George also participated in that cavalcade of younger pupils or children, but he, despite that, stand a bit out, an outstanding person with his authority surrounding. I saw him many times in high school. We went over there 2 years in common. Even during breaks between classes in the corridor, or when we sometimes exchanged some few words. He remained in my memories as a really outstanding person. Despite that 2 years is not so much. George had the great authority everywhere among his classmates as well. The Radda family was not a fan of the Soviet-type system. Jury was, despite that, admitted to the university immediately after graduating in the Pannonhalma school, and was at the university when the family left Hungary in '56. As I don't know whether the son Tibor knew the way how the students from Pannonhalma left the college secretly in a Sunday mass was when the supervision of the fathers was not so strong. And the pupils was unified in that, about 15 or so, that going through the building to the church, it's not a supervised period. And they left the march to the... And the fathers realized that after the Mass, as I know. Oh, not sure, quite sure, in that anecdote. Aber es ist schon written, so a lot of written memories have emerged of this. It is understandable that the Radda family, when the opportunity arose, left the country. So in 1956. From then on, only scattered news reached me, mainly from classmates from my own class, who had also gone abroad. Some of them, 1/3 of the classes left that period of time the country. My class was also so that they left us. We started 40 persons in the high school, and the graduation in Hungary could reach 24 persons. And as I know, but maybe Tibor is better informed, the Austrian government organized a supplementary course for those from Pannonhalma outcoming students who could reach the graduation in 57 in parallel with the classmates who remained at home. So I think I have mentioned everything I wanted, the memory can be much richer, but I don't want to take your time more. George Radda is a person for me, an example of a scientific career which can be paralleled with those who remained at home. A very high, great career, and I am especially proud of that I am in so early contact with him. Thank you so much.
And finally, I ask Father Albin Juhász-Latic, headmaster of the Benedictine High School of Pannonhalma, Sir George Radda's former school, as we heard it several times today.
Thank you very much, and as a consolation also, Father Conrad can tell that my homilies are rather short. Of course, this won't be a homily, but I won't be long, I promise. My task was to talk about the monastic roots of Sir George Radda's academic career. And it is a huge privilege and a profound responsibility to deliver this final reflection today on the life and legacy of Sir George Radda, scientist, teacher, mentor, and notably a man whose formative years were shaped within the monastic tradition of the Benedictine school of Pannonhalma. My task is to focus on this last element, the lesser known yet deeply influential 4 years of formation in Sir George Radda's life. His achievements in biochemistry and imaging technology are widely recognized. Yet, his legacy is not measured by scientific accomplishments alone, but also by a character forged at the confluence of faith, intellect, and community during these high school years in Pannonhalma. So my lecture is a brief introduction into the monastic tradition as lived in the Arch Abbey and its adjacent school.
This is one of the most important parts of the library. This is the Archbishop Monastery, this is the adjacent school, and we told about with us today.
The photos you will see are not primarily intended to inform, but rather to evoke the atmosphere, the vibe of a lived experience. Today, I would like to consider three monastic virtues: community, stability, and humility, as the hidden architecture behind Sir George's scientific career. These virtues are often overlooked in our time. Some may even regard them as outdated or irrelevant. I believe, or rather, I have the experience that the opposite is true. Working in a school, mentoring young people of the Alpha generation, and teaching history in an era when even established facts are routinely questioned, I witness daily that these virtues, community, stability, and humility, remain as vital as ever. They are not relics of a vanished past. They are remedies for our present. Just this morning, I held my final history class of the school year with the 11th grade. We were covering the Hungarian Kulturkampf, not at first glance a topic likely to stir much excitement. So I designed a version of Double Jeopardy around it. And to my surprise, I watched 17-year-olds argue, guess, compete, and become fully engaged with a rather stern bit of history. Why? Because they were together. This mobile-dependent generation needs community, just as a desert dweller needs water. When looking at these three values, community, stability, and humility, one must acknowledge that Benedictine formation and scientific inquiry were deeply interconnected in the Middle Ages. In this sense, Oxford, and Pannonhalma for that matter, never truly left that heritage behind. We are still in the medieval times. Sir George felt at home in both places because these values shaped environments where science and humanity could flourish side by side. Let me begin with community. To quote Father Sebastian Samai, a Hungarian-born American monk and philosopher, one of my three spiritual role models and masters, and my English is much worse than his, but he had this very Hunglish translation, just like I do. Father Albin, community is not the icing on the cake, it's the cake. In the rule of Saint Benedict, community is not a casual gathering of like-minded individuals. It is a discipline. At Pannonhalma, as in every Benedictine house, the community is a kind of crucible, not to erase individual peculiarities, but to refine them. The strong are called to bear with the weak because God sometimes chooses to reveal something vital, precisely through the fragile and the young. In the vision of Saint Benedict, talents and opportunities are not to be hoarded, but gathered into something greater than the sum of their parts. In such a community, opposing views are not silenced, but held in tension until something new can emerge, an insight, a shared truth, a hypothesis. This is what makes monastic life so surprisingly parallel to the life of science. Today, in both monastic and academic contexts, such communities are under threat. Hyper-individualism, ideological silos, and the glorification of originality, over collaboration, make it so difficult to sustain these shared places. Yet, Sir George's work reminds us how essential they are. From his earliest formation at Pannonhalma to his long tenure at Merton College, he was not only building laboratories, he was nurturing communities of inquiry. For him, collaboration was not a management tool, it was a moral conviction. In the Baroque refectory, the monk's dining hall, one finds a series of painted emblems, symbolic images paired with Latin inscriptions to convey moral wisdom. One shows a set of keys, some small, some large, bound together on a single key chain. The accompanying motto reads, "Non omnia possumus omnes." No one can do everything. But bound together in community, those keys can open every door of the house and beyond. The second monastic virtue I wish to highlight is stability, or in Latin, stabilitas loci. While originally it referred to remaining rooted in a particular monastery, its deeper meaning is fidelity, the commitment to endure, especially in times of difficulties. Scientific research, like the monastic path, is not typically marked by sudden revelations. It is shaped through long periods of trial and error, frustration and waiting. It is easy to remain committed when experiments succeed and papers are accepted, and as I today learned, not flatly rejected. It is far more demanding and ultimately more formative to remain faithful when things fall apart. Sir George Radda understood this deeply. His was not a story of effortless ascent, but one of tenacity, adaptation, and unwavering commitment. He had to leave his homeland and rebuild his life in a new language and culture. His stability was not passive endurance. It was the active courage to begin again and again and again. In science, as in life, solutions are often arising not from breakthroughs, but from resilience and fresh attempts. This is not only a lesson for great scientists. It is something we try to cultivate at every level of education, even in a high school level. Let me offer an example from a current student of our school, Barnabás Szilágyi, who is with us today, a late successor to Sir George in spirit. At this year's National Mathematics Competition, 3 students, am I correct? 3 students solved every problem without a single mistake. Am I correct that there were 3 of you? Yes. To break the tie, the committee looked for something more. They awarded the first prize to the one student who reached the same solution in 2 distinct ways, refusing to settle for the first path only. That student was Barnabás. This is what fidelity looks like. Not giving up, but going deeper and deeper. Not walking away when the walk becomes difficult, or we can just lean back, but returning to it with renewed insight. Sir George lived that virtue, stabilitas loci, not only in science, but in life. Because through stability, we learn to love what we do. Not chasing success for its own sake, but seeking to grasp its deeper meaning, to understand the essence of our vocation, and to receive what God has entrusted to us with reverence and care. This year, our school established a new award named Radda György Award of Sir George Radda, to recognize a student who has clearly embodied the Benedictine virtue of stability through consistent effort and perseverance. Many of you might well remember that a prayer was recited at Sir George Radda's funeral in Hungarian. Mennyei atyánk, szenteld meg erőfeszítéseinket, hogy munkatársaid lehessünk. Heavenly Father, bless our efforts that we may become your co-workers. He, Sir George Radda, learned this prayer during his high school years at Pannonhalma, and he continued to say it every day throughout his academic career. So central was it to his life and vocation that he wished it to be part of his final farewell. This is why we created this award, to honor the student who has most grown in perseverance and commitment, and who has discovered, like Sir George did, that faithfulness in effort in itself is itself a form of divine grace. A student for whom one good solution does not suffice, but seeks always another one. Finally, we must speak of humility. True humilitas of the rule of Saint Benedict is not about thinking less of oneself, but about knowing one's place in the order of things. Benedict writes in his rule, if you do something good, always attribute it to God. Or, in more temporary terms, as I heard in Oxford from Professor Tracy, Sir George usually said, think twice before you say nothing. This is the humility of knowing that the silence we choose in a discussion may be more constructive than the cleverness we are tempted to offer. This is not the kind of humility that stifles ambition or curbs curiosity. On the contrary, it allows us to take risks, to ask naive questions without shame, and above all, listen, because we are not obsessed with our image, but oriented toward truth. The very first word of the rule of Saint Benedict is ausculta. We have a Latin scholar here. I wonder if one could translate this ausculta this way: think twice before you say nothing. In the laboratory, as in the monastery, being humble does not mean being passive. It is the disciplined awareness that we are always learning, always dependent, always unfinished. Sir George carried this humility with him throughout his life. Despite his global standing, he remained deeply grounded, generous with his time, and curious to the end. So what do we learn from the monastic roots of an academic life? We learn that community is not an accessory to achievement. It is its precondition. We learn that stability, staying with a question, a place, a person, is not stagnation, but growth. And we learn that humility is not weakness, but the bedrock of intellectual integrity. Sir George Radda's legacy reminds us that real discovery grows in community, matures through fidelity, and is sustained by humility. At Pannonhalma, we are proud that his journey began in a place that believed this. And we are proud and grateful that his life proved it to be true. Thank you very much.
I would like to say thank you to all of the speakers for sharing their thoughts and kind memories, and also many thanks for the audience to their attention they paid.